Across the sprawling tapestry of galactic civilization, where 1,000 species mingled in the cosmic equivalent of a very expensive, very dangerous cocktail party, one truth remained as constant as the laws of physics. Might makes right. Not the crude, club-wielding might of primitive worlds, mind you, but the refined, scientifically categorized might of the apex predator classification system. A bureaucratic marvel that somehow managed to turn natural selection into a filing system. The classification wasn't particularly creative in its naming conventions. Class A predators ruled the roost, their very presence causing lesser beings to develop sudden urges to be elsewhere. Class B predators earned respectful nods and wide berths in station corridors. Class C predators got polite acknowledgement and moderate personal space. And then there were the unfortunate souls relegated to Class D and below, the herbivores, the scavengers, the beings whose ancestors had apparently missed the memo about developing proper teeth. Aboard the research vessel Methodical Inquiry, this hierarchy played out with the subtle grace of a diplomatic ballet. If diplomatic ballets involved a lot of nervous fidgeting and strategic seating arrangements. The ship's crew represented a veritable rainbow of evolutionary paths, each species occupying their designated rung on the ladder of lethality. At the top of this particular food chain sat Commander Vex, a towering Krillian whose chitinous exterior gleamed like polished obsidian and whose mandibles could theoretically crack hull plating. Not that anyone had tested this, but the insurance forms were quite specific about such possibilities. Vex commanded respect through the simple expedient of being able to digest most of the crew without seasoning. Below him, the ship's tactical officer maintained order through a combination of professional competence and the kind of retractable clause that made even the most rebellious crew member reconsider their life choices. The various Class B specimens handled specialized duties with the quiet confidence of beings who knew exactly where they stood in the cosmic order. Dangerous enough to matter, civilized enough to use utensils. And then there was the human. She sat in the corner of the observation deck, hunched over a data pad with the kind of focused intensity that suggested either deep scientific thought or a particularly engaging puzzle game. Her species classification had been the subject of considerable debate among the galactic taxonomists, who had eventually settled on Class D, with all the enthusiasm of beings filling out tax forms, small, soft, lacking in obvious weapons, and possessed of the kind of round features that triggered protective instincts in most civilized species. The humans were, by all reasonable measures, harmless. This particular specimen reinforced every stereotype. She barely reached the chest plates of most crew members, her pale skin unmarked by the ritual scars of warrior cultures, her movements carrying none of the predatory grace that marked the truly dangerous. When she spoke, which was rarely, her voice carried the kind of musical quality that suggested she'd be more at home singing lullabies than commanding battlefields. The crew had taken to her with the indulgent affection typically reserved for mascots or particularly clever pets. They made sure she got the choicest food portions, always checked that she was comfortable during long shifts, and maintained a careful watch to ensure none of the more aggressive species made her nervous. It was touching, really, in the way that watching a daycare center was touching. Lots of big, dangerous creatures being very gentle with something small and fragile. She seemed to appreciate the attention, responding with the kind of shy smiles that reinforced everyone's conviction that humans were nature's attempt at creating the perfect, non-threatening species. Her research into interspecies behavioral patterns provided just enough scientific justification for her presence to satisfy the bureaucrats, while her complete lack of intimidation factor made her the ideal neutral party for sensitive negotiations. The morning shift had settled into its usual rhythm when the ship's senses detected something that would, in hindsight, be remembered as the moment everything changed. A Class A biological signature, massive and aggressive, had been spotted on the planet they were surveying. The discovery sent ripples of excitement through the crew. Class A specimens were rare, dangerous, and scientifically invaluable. Commander Vex's mandibles clicked with approval as he reviewed the sensor data. A genuine apex predator, probably territorial, definitely hostile to intruders. The kind of creature that would provide months of research material and enough academic papers to advance several careers. The kind of creature that would also, quite possibly, eat half the research team if they weren't extremely careful. The human looked up from her datapad, her expression carrying the kind of mild interest that suggested she was more concerned about her lunch schedule than the presence of a creature that could theoretically use her as a toothpick. This reaction was so perfectly, stereotypically human that several crew members felt their protective instincts surge. Something that innocent shouldn't be exposed to something that dangerous. But the universe, as any experienced traveler knew, had a particularly twisted sense of humor, and sometimes, just sometimes, it enjoyed reminding everyone that appearances could be deceiving in the most spectacular ways possible. The research mission was approved with the kind of careful planning that came from knowing exactly what they were dealing with, or, more accurately, what they thought they were dealing with. The human was assigned to the support team, safely positioned behind multiple layers of Class A security, where she could observe and record without being exposed to any actual danger. After all, they reasoned, what could possibly go wrong with keeping the harmless little human away from the big, scary predator? The universe, listening to this question, began to chuckle. The planet below looked deceptively peaceful from orbit, its surface a patchwork of emerald forests and crystalline lakes that would have made excellent tourism brochures, if not for the minor inconvenience of hosting creatures that viewed visitors as convenient protein packages. The atmospheric readings were standard, the gravity manageable, and the indigenous flora showed all the signs of a thriving ecosystem, which, as any xenobiologist worth their tenure would tell you, was exactly the kind of environment that produced really impressive predators. Commander Vex assembled his team with the methodical precision of someone who had survived long enough to develop a healthy respect for things that could kill him. The expedition would consist of 2 Class A specimens for heavy protection, 3 Class B researchers for specialized analysis, and a carefully selected support crew positioned at what the tactical manuals optimistically called safe distances. The human had been assigned to the orbital monitoring station, where she could observe the proceedings through high-resolution sensors while remaining safely tucked away from anything with teeth. This decision had been made with the kind of unanimous approval typically reserved for hazard pay raises and extended shore leave. Everyone agreed that exposing their resident mascot to actual danger would be both ethically questionable and tactically unnecessary. She had accepted this assignment with the same quiet grace that marked all her interactions, though those paying close attention might have noticed the way her eyes tracked the tactical displays with an intensity that seemed oddly focused for someone supposedly relegated to passive observation. But then, humans were known for their curious nature, a trait that everyone found endearing, right up until it got them into trouble. The descent to the planet's surface proceeded with textbook efficiency. The Class A security team established a perimeter with the kind of professional competence that came from years of not being eaten, while the research specialists began their preliminary surveys. The alien landscape stretched around them, beautiful and serene and absolutely teeming with the kind of life that had evolved specifically to turn unwary visitors into fertilizer. The first sign of trouble came from the Class B tactical officer, whose enhanced sensory organs detected movement patterns that suggested coordinated hunting behavior. Something large, or several somethings large, had taken notice of the newcomers and was displaying the kind of interest that predators reserved for potential meals. The readings were consistent with pack behavior, territorial marking, and what the computers euphemistically classified as aggressive reconnaissance. From her position in orbit, the human watched the tactical displays with the kind of attention that suggested she was following a particularly engaging mystery novel. Her fingers moved across the sensor controls with surprising dexterity, fine-tuning the resolution and adjusting the spectral analysis parameters. When she spoke, her voice carried that same musical quality that made everyone think of bedtime stories. The thermal signatures are clustering in a pattern consistent with ambush predation, she observed, her tone carrying the kind of mild interest one might use to comment on weather patterns. They're using the terrain features to mask their approach vectors, probably coordinating through subsonic communication. The tactical officer's secondary appendages twitched with approval. The little human had good observational skills, even if her analysis was limited by her species' inferior sensory capabilities. It was rather like watching a child play at being a scientist, enduring in its earnestness, if ultimately limited by biological constraints. The creature they had come to study revealed itself with the kind of dramatic flair that suggested it had been practicing. It emerged from the forest canopy like a living avalanche, its massive form combining the worst aspects of several different nightmares into one spectacularly lethal package. The sensor readings went haywire as they tried to process something that was simultaneously reptilian, mammalian, and apparently capable of localized gravity manipulation. The Class A specimens in the landing party responded with the kind of professional calm that came from extensive training and very good life insurance policies. They activated their combat protocols, established defensive positions, and began the complex dance of keeping something extremely dangerous from eating everyone involved. The tactical displays showed a textbook example of apex predator behavior, territorial assertion, threat assessment, and the kind of casual confidence that came from being at the top of the food chain. But the human's attention had shifted to something else entirely. While everyone else focused on the obvious threat, she had noticed the smaller signatures moving through the underbrush. The pack hunters that had been stalking the research team, now emboldened by the presence of their alpha, were beginning to close the net. Her fingers danced across the controls with increasing urgency, tracking movement patterns that the others had missed. "Commander," she said, her voice still carrying that same musical quality, but now with an undertone that somehow made everyone pay attention. "We have a problem." The tactical display she transmitted to the landing party showed the true scope of their situation. The massive predator wasn't just defending territory, it was coordinating a hunting party. The smaller creatures were pack hunters, using their alpha's distraction to position themselves for a coordinated strike. The research team wasn't facing one apex predator. They were facing an entire ecosystem that had decided they looked tasty. Commander Vex's mandibles clicked with what might have been approval or concern. With Krillians, the emotional nuances were often lost in translation. The situation had escalated from a research opportunity to a survival scenario, and the carefully planned expedition was rapidly becoming an exercise in not being eaten. From orbit, the human continued her observations with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she was seeing patterns that others missed. Her analysis had shifted from academic interest to something that felt almost like predatory assessment, though everyone dismissed this impression as a trick of the lighting. After all, humans were observers, not participants in the ancient dance of hunter and hunted. The planet's apex predator circled the landing party with the kind of patient confidence that suggested it had all the time in the world. Its pack moved through the shadows with practiced coordination, each member perfectly positioned to cut off escape routes and funnel the prey toward the killing ground. It was a masterclass in cooperative hunting, beautiful in its efficiency and absolutely terrifying in its implications. And through it all, the human watched from her safe position in orbit, her expression carrying the kind of quiet intensity that suggested she was learning something important about the nature of predation, something that would, in the very near future, fundamentally change how the galaxy viewed the harmless little species from the third planet of an unremarkable star system. The stage was set for a lesson in the subtle differences between being harmless and choosing to be peaceful. The attack came with a kind of synchronized precision that would have been impressive if it weren't so utterly terrifying. The pack hunters burst from their concealment like a living tide of claws and fangs, their movements coordinated with the efficiency of a species that had spent millions of years perfecting the art of collaborative murder. The carefully planned research expedition dissolved into chaos faster than a sugar cube in acid rain. The Class A security team responded with admirable professionalism, their combat protocols kicking in with the smooth efficiency of beings who had trained for exactly this scenario. Energy weapons discharged with satisfying zaps, defensive barriers materialized with reassuring hums, and tactical communications crackled with the kind of calm efficiency that suggested everything was under control. It was the planet's apex predator had been studying them just as intently as they had been studying it, and its assessment of their capabilities had been considerably more accurate than theirs had been of its intentions. The creature moved with the kind of fluid grace that suggested gravity was more of a suggestion than a law, its massive form weaving through the defensive perimeter with embarrassing ease. Commander Vex found himself in the unfamiliar position of being outmaneuvered by something that should have been following predictable territorial behavior patterns. The tactical manuals had been quite specific about apex predator responses to perceived threats, and nothing in the literature had prepared him for a creature that seemed to be actively strategizing rather than simply defending. The Class B tactical officer's enhanced senses were registering threat signatures that didn't match any known classification system. The pack hunters weren't just coordinating with Alpha, they were adapting their tactics in real time, learning from each defensive response and adjusting their approach accordingly. It was the kind of behavioral complexity that suggested intelligence levels far beyond what the initial surveys had indicated. From her orbital perch, the human watched the unfolding catastrophe with an expression that had shifted from mild interest to something approaching professional assessment. Her fingers moved across the sensor controls with increasing urgency, not the frantic desperation of someone watching colleagues in mortal danger, but the focused intensity of someone analyzing a complex problem. "They're herding them," she said, her voice carrying that same musical quality, but now with an undertone that made everyone in the monitoring station pay attention. "The pack isn't trying to kill them. They're driving them toward a specific location." The tactical display she highlighted showed the truth of her observation. The research team wasn't being attacked so much as they were being maneuvered, pushed inexorably toward a particular section of the forest where the terrain formed a natural amphitheater. The pack hunters were using classic herding tactics, cutting off escape routes while leaving specific paths open, guiding their prey toward what was presumably a more advantageous killing ground. But the human's attention had shifted again, this time to something that made her posture straighten with sudden alertness. The massive apex predator had stopped its attack and was now staring directly at the orbital monitoring station, not at the planet's surface, not at the research team, but at the specific coordinates of the station itself. But he was looking at her. The creature's eyes, massive, intelligent, and carrying the kind of ancient wisdom that came from being at the top of the food chain for geological ages, focused on something it couldn't possibly see but somehow knew was there. The pack hunters stopped their coordinated assault and turned their attention skyward, their predatory instincts suddenly fixated on a target that existed beyond their immediate environment. The human stood up from her monitoring station with the kind of fluid motion that suggested her previous hunched posture had been more of a conscious choice than a natural state. When she spoke, her voice carried none of the musical quality that had marked her previous communications. Instead, it held the kind of calm authority that made everyone in the monitoring station suddenly reassess their assumptions about human vocal capability. "I need to go down there," she said, and something in her tone suggested this wasn't really a request. The station commander, a sensible Class B specimen who had survived this long by making reasonable decisions, responded with the kind of immediate negative that suggested he understood the implications of losing their resident mascot to planetary predators. The human safety was everyone's responsibility, and exposing her to the kind of creatures that were currently terrorizing trained military personnel was exactly the kind of decision that led to very uncomfortable conversations with superior officers. But the human was already moving toward the transport bay with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she had made her decision and was no longer particularly interested in committee discussions. Her movements carried none of the hesitant uncertainty that had marked her previous behavior. Instead, she moved with the kind of efficient grace that suggested she knew exactly where she was going and exactly what she intended to do when she got there. The transport launch was unauthorized, unscheduled, and executed with the kind of technical precision that suggested the human had considerably more piloting experience than her personnel file indicated. The small craft descended through the atmosphere with navigation that was either very lucky or very skilled, avoiding the kind of detection systems that would have made her arrival anything less than a complete surprise. She landed in the forest clearing with the kind of controlled crash that suggested she had done this before, though when and where remained mysterious. The research team, still engaged in their desperate struggle against mathematically superior odds, barely noticed the arrival of what appeared to be a completely unsuitable rescue attempt. The human emerged from the transport wreckage with her clothing torn and her hair disheveled, looking for all the world like someone who had just survived a traumatic accident. She stumbled into the clearing with the kind of vulnerability that triggered every protective instinct in the vicinity, her appearance suggesting she was exactly the kind of helpless prey that predators found irresistible. The massive apex predator turned its attention from the research team to this new arrival, its ancient eyes assessing something that didn't quite fit the established patterns. The pack hunters shifted their positions, their predatory instincts suddenly focused on what appeared to be the most vulnerable target in the immediate area, and then the human looked up. Her eyes met those of the apex predator, And something passed between them that transcended species boundaries, classification systems, and millions of years of evolutionary divergence. It was recognition, acknowledgement, and understanding all rolled into a single moment of perfect clarity. The apex predator's massive form shifted, its aggressive posture melting into something that was unmistakably protective. With movements that suggested reverence rather than dominance, the creature positioned itself between the human and its own pack, its body language communicating something that every predator in the vicinity understood instinctively. The pack hunters froze, their coordinated assault dissolving into confusion as their alpha's behavior violated every instinct they possessed. The research team watched in stunned silence as the planet's most dangerous creature assumed a defensive posture that suggested it was prepared to fight its own kind to protect someone it had never met. The human smiled, and for the first time, everyone present understood that they had been making a very fundamental error in their assumptions about the nature of harmlessness. The aftermath of a revelation is always awkward, particularly when that revelation involves the complete restructuring of one's understanding of the fundamental nature of reality. The research team stood in the forest clearing, their various appendages twitching with the kind of nervous energy that comes from watching everything you thought you knew about the universe get turned inside out and handed back to you with a polite note suggesting you might want to reconsider your assumption. The human, their harmless, gentle, music-voiced mascot, stood calmly in the shadow of the planet's apex predator, her posture suggesting she was exactly where she belonged. The massive creature maintained its protective stance with the kind of patient alertness that suggested it would remain there until the heat death of the universe if necessary. Its pack hunters had retreated to what could only be described as a respectful distance, their predatory instincts apparently overruled by something that transcended their understanding of the natural order. Commander Vex's mandibles clicked with what might have been confusion, concern, or the Quilian equivalent of a nervous breakdown. His carefully organized worldview, built on millions of years of evolutionary precedent and reinforced by galactic bureaucracy, had just been subjected to the kind of logical inconsistency that made philosophers drink heavily and taxonomists consider career changes. The Class B tactical officers' enhanced sensors were registering readings that didn't match any known classification parameters. The human's biosignature remained consistent with previous measurements. No sudden spikes in adrenaline, no elevation in stress hormones, no indication of the kind of chemical changes that typically accompanied life-threatening situations. She was, by all measurable standards, completely relaxed. This was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire situation. The human spoke, her voice carrying that same musical quality, but now with an undertone that suggested hidden depths of meaning. "Your classification system is missing some rather important variables," she said, her tone carrying the kind of gentle correction that teachers use when explaining why 2 plus 2 doesn't equal fish. She gestured toward the apex predator with the casual familiarity of someone indicating a particularly interesting piece of furniture. "Your analysis focuses on physical capabilities, territorial behavior, and hunting efficiency. But you've overlooked the most crucial factor in predator classification, the capacity for strategic restraint." The research team exchanged glances with a kind of silent communication that suggested they were all wondering if they had somehow missed a fundamental principle of xenobiology during their expensive educations. The human's words carried the weight of obvious truth, but the implications were staggering enough to require significant mental adjustment. "This magnificent creature," she continued, her hand moving to rest against the apex predator's flank with casual affection, "represents millions of years of evolutionary refinement. It's perfectly designed for its environment, supremely adapted for survival, and capable of eliminating any threat with minimal effort. But it also possesses something that your classification system doesn't account for: the wisdom to choose when not to use those capabilities." The apex predator's eyes fixed on the research team with the kind of patient assessment that suggested it was evaluating them for something more significant than nutritional value. Its pack hunters remained at their respectful distance, their postures suggesting they were awaiting instructions from someone who understood the deeper implications of the situation. The human smile carried the kind of gentle amusement that suggested she was enjoying a private joke that everyone else was about to understand. "You see, the most dangerous predators aren't the ones who kill everything they encounter. They're the ones who could kill everything they encounter, but choose not to. They're the ones who understand that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to protect." Commander Vex's mandibles clicked with what was definitely recognition. The implications were settling into his consciousness with the kind of uncomfortable clarity that accompanied major paradigm shifts. The human species, classified as harmless due to their apparent lack of obvious weapons, their peaceful demeanor and their tendency to avoid confrontation, had been systematically misunderstood by the entire galactic community. The tactical officer's secondary appendages twitched as he processed the new information through his enhanced analytical capabilities. The human's seemingly inferior sensory organs, their soft physical construction, their musical vocalizations, all of these characteristics had been evaluated through the lens of predator classification and found wanting. But what if they had been looking at the wrong metrics entirely? Your species, the human continued, her voice carrying the kind of patient explanation that suggested she had been waiting for someone to ask the right questions, has developed impressive classification systems for identifying threats. But you've missed the most fundamental truth about predation. The deadliest hunters are often the ones who appear least dangerous. She gestured toward the forest around them, where the local ecosystem had settled into a watchful calm. Every creature on this planet recognizes what you've overlooked. They understand that predation isn't about size or claws or obvious weapons. It's about the capacity to eliminate threats with maximum efficiency and minimum effort. It's about the kind of strategic thinking that allows a species to thrive in any environment. The apex predator's massive head turned toward the human with the kind of respectful attention that suggested it was learning something important about the nature of its own existence. The pack hunters shifted their positions, their movements suggesting they were beginning to understand that their previous hunting strategies had been fundamentally incomplete. The human's expression carried the kind of gentle satisfaction that comes from watching students finally grasp a difficult concept. Humans appear harmless because we've learned that appearing dangerous is often counterproductive. We've developed the capacity to blend into any social structure, to be underestimated and overlooked, to observe and analyze without triggering defensive responses. We've become the ultimate adaptive predators. The research team stood in stunned silence as the full implications of this revelation settled into their consciousness. The humans, with their soft appearances and gentle mannerisms, weren't failed predators who had somehow survived through luck and alliance building. They were the most successful predators in the galaxy, so perfectly adapted to their niche that they had convinced everyone else they were harmless. The apex predator's protective stance had been an acknowledgement of something that transcended species boundaries. The recognition of a fellow apex predator. Not one that competed through obvious displays of strength, but one that had achieved dominance through the far more dangerous strategy of being consistently underestimated. As the research team prepared for their extraction, the human remained in the clearing with her newfound companion, her posture suggesting she was exactly where she belonged. The apex predator maintained its protective stance, its pack hunters arranged in a formation that suggested they were guarding something precious rather than containing something dangerous. The universe, observing this scene with the kind of cosmic satisfaction that comes from a particularly well-executed plot twist, allowed itself a moment of quiet amusement. After all, the best jokes were always the ones where the punchline had been visible from the beginning, if only anyone had been clever enough to recognize it. The harmless little human smiled and settled in to continue her research, surrounded by the kind of protective detail that money couldn't buy, but mutual respect could command. And somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of galactic civilization, a classification system prepared to undergo the kind of fundamental revision that would keep taxonomists busy for generations. The universe, it seemed, had quite the sense of humor after all.